Cool. All right. I got a second chance for this. Hey, guess what? It's our 2-year anniversary. We've been doing this for 2 years.
2 years. We are complete professionals now.
Yeah. Definitely record everything that we need to.
Yes, and always in one take.
I don't know what else to say other than I've been having a blast, and I can't believe that we've been doing it for 2 years.
And thanks to all of you who've been listening.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel silly getting so excited every Wednesday when I see how many people listen on release day, and it's heartwarming. So thank you all, and thank you, Bruce, to being such a great co-host.
I am a great co-host, and you know what? You are too, Andy. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
I'm an excellent co-host. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And welcome to episode 87. 87.
Sure.
Our 2-year anniversary special. Hey. Boop, 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 boop,
That's right. 2 years, 87 episodes. You can figure out the math on that one.
Yeah. I think we've only skipped like a week or two here and there from illness. I mean,
we're in good shape.
You know what? We've pulled this one out. I've been having a lot of fun. And what's more fun in the game of Magic than drawing cards? Am I right?
Well, I think just about everything is more fun than drawing cards. I'm way more excited about playing the cards than drawing the cards. But there's a lot of people that are excited about drawing the cards, and I completely understand that, because to play the cards, you must draw the cards.
If you had a card that was just pay X, draw a card, even if it's just an enchantment, if it's pay X, draw a card, or, I mean, is it... Would you play it? I mean, like, obviously, like, rate-wise, of course, but what am I trying to say here? What am I trying to say, Bruce? This is your topic. Let you introduce it.
Sure. Well, I look at it like this. I mean, there's a couple of ways to go about, with the topic of card draw, and you can talk about what's an appropriate rate. But honestly, I don't really want to go down that road. Whether you're looking at Phyrexian Arena, where you're paying a life, you draw a card, but you're limited to that one card, or a Sign in Blood, or something along that line. All of that, requires you to look at the situation and determine what makes the most sense. And even in just the situation I've described, when I'm comparing those two, Sign in Blood gets you the cards now, whereas Phyrexian Arena, if your games go long enough, will get you more cards. But it's going to be a longer, drawn-out process. So I don't really want to go down that road. What I want to talk about more is how many card draw spells are too many, and how you build around that. So arguably, you can say that you should have 10 ramp spells in your deck. Well, that's great. But how many card draw spells should you have in your deck? And I think that number can vary quite a bit, depending on the kind of card draw that you're counting and how you're doing it. So I wanted to spend the next hour to talk about card draw and just sort of look at the options and sort of get a sense of what we want. So
with how much is too much, I think you also have to define how little is too little, which, I mean, card draw is almost always the last thing I end up putting in decks, unless it is like required by the deck. Like if I was going to make like a Niv Mizzet Perrin deck, like card draw would be 40% of the deck.
Right. I always look at it, the difficulty I have with card draw is that it's one of the areas where it seems like quite often when I'm looking at the theme for my deck, that the only card draw options that fit the theme are, blah, 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 theme of deck, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end it says, and draw a card. So it's,
right.
I mean, it's that cantrip. It's, it's that sort of the add-on that's slapped onto the back of the card. And I am not going to poo-poo the, somebody who includes that card in their deck because, I mean, hey, it fits the theme and you get to draw a card. But generally speaking, if I'm looking at putting a card in a deck because it draws a card, then I want it to draw more than one card. I'm looking for a little more than that. So, I mean, roughly speaking, you're looking at 4 different options when you're talking about card draw. You're talking about your cantrips, and these are essentially the cards that I've just described. They slap and draw a card at the end of the card, and you're essentially all it's saying is replace this card. So the cost of casting anything is the mana cost, and then there's the cost of the actual physical card itself. You spent a turn, right? You spent a turn drawing
you're
it.
Using card advantage to an extent,
right? So if you get a card that has a cantrip, you're essentially replacing what you lost. So, and that's great. A lot of really good cards do this. They replace the card loss. But if I'm looking at card draw and commander, I want to find cards that dig deeper into the deck. So, but there's cantrips. Then there's your instant draw cards that will, that you can play at any point in time in the game to draw you a card. That's a little more difficult to do, but there are cards out there that do that. And then I'm looking at mass draw, which has an overlap with the instants, but these are the ones that draw X cards, and and they don't have to say X. They could say 5. They could say 3. You're drawing multiple cards. I just say X.
Right.
And then finally, there's the cards that do repeatable draw. So each turn draw a card. Whenever something happens, draw a card. These are cards when you're playing them in your deck. The expectation is you're expecting to draw multiple cards while this card's on the battlefield. So
yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that the card draw that is repeatable is going to find its way into decks more often because you have to do less each time you do it. That you have to put in less resources each time you draw a card. I don't know. I find that cantrippy stuff I play less. I don't know if that's right, but I mean, especially if the card just says draw X cards, it's just less exciting for me. Even if it's like a good card, like a Blue Sun Zenith or something. That draws you cards, right?
Well, you or somebody else, but yes.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I'm looking at, though, because when you're putting cards into your deck, if the card is, card does something and draw a card, I rarely ever include that as a card, as one of the card. I don't count that as a card that draws me a card. I count that as a card that does something else. The card draw is a bonus as far as I'm concerned. And then if you look at the mana cost of the card, usually that's where you see that, okay, it's not free, it's just built into the cost, and I get that. But when it comes to actual card draw cards that I would put in that category, I tend to lean a lot more towards the mass draw or the repeatable. And I'm never sure exactly how many of those to actually put in a deck. And I appreciate that it will vary depending on how many cantrips you've put in. Because, I mean, if virtually every other card in your deck says draw a card, you're not going to need that many other cards that say draw X cards or draw a card whenever something happens. So that can go down. But I'm never sure. One of my issues with card draw is the idea of the mass draw. So like the Blue Sun Zenith. I get the idea, the benefit that if you draw that many cards immediately, you're getting access to all of them right away. The difficulty, though, is that with a spell like that, say you draw 5 cards. If you already have 5 cards in hand, at the end of your turn, you're going to be discarding unless you can play them out. So I always feel like I'm not getting the full benefit. Now, I understand that you are, because you're adding those 5 cards, so now you've got 10 cards in hand. Even if you don't play any of them, and you have to discard 3, you're discarding the 3 cards that you need the least, and keeping the best 7. That's a pretty good trade-off, and I appreciate that. However, I always I find myself in games that go longer. So these cards that give you a card draw when something happens, I find they tend to
happen more.
Well, yeah, and I get more benefit from them. I appreciate I'm not getting all the cards early, and that is a downside, and I understand that. But the upside is I also feel like a card like Phyrexian Arena is very easy for everyone else to ignore. So you're doubling the amount of cards you're drawing, period. You're just doubling it. And nobody is really even thinking twice about the fact that you're seeing twice as many cards. But if you do Blue Sun Zenith, and the net result over, 5 turns is that you've drawn 5 extra cards, it's the same as the Arena, but better because you got them all early. The downside, though, is that everybody else watched you draw 5. And then everybody else starts thinking, you need to be dealt with because you now have access to all of these cards. Whereas Phyrexian Arena was giving you the same level of access, but it was sort of, it was going under the radar at the table. So I tend to lean towards repeatable draw, but either way, I'm still not sure which is the better option. If you're doing mass draw spells, if that's your choice because you want the cards immediately, how many of those do you put in your deck? Because arguably, you want to see those cards relatively early in the game. I would think by turn 4, you want to see something like that so you can draw a handful of cards.
Yeah. What you had just brought up was a really interesting point that I didn't actually think about with respect to this topic. But we tend to play longer games. More turns means more incidental draw just because you have a draw per turn.
Right.
And because of that, my curve tends to be a little bigger. So I don't feel like I need to end up drawing those cards earlier, whether they're high cost or not, because I'm going to be drawing each turn anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you and I play in a meta where if you're running a 7-drop, odds are you'll get, if you play the 7-drop on curve, you'll probably have them out there for 4, 5, 6, 7 turns. I mean, I'm not, that doesn't actually happen. Those cards get dealt with faster, but that's sort of the pace that we're moving at. So we're willing to look at stuff like that. So a card like Blue Sun Zenith, arguably, if it's played later in the game, is going to end up drawing you 7, 8 cards. And, and it's an instant, so you can, end of turn it.
And it's interesting, too, because, I mean, with our tendency to play bigger spells and kind of let the games go on long, drawing is less fun, like you were saying, because we have these bigger spells that do these bigger things than just draw a card. And, of course, drawing cards is exciting, because for one, it means you're still in the game. 2, it kind of just, it's this exciting, what am I going to get next?
Yeah.
And, that's the excitement behind drawing cards. Obviously, it gets you the things you might need. And to an extent, it is a form of tutoring. If you have these ways of just, drawing your whole deck, then you've tutored every card you need.
Right. Well, I mean, not that long ago, we played with Andrew McGreeny, and he played his Quain deck, and it worked out that I think there was one turn where did we each draw 20, or was it just me because I already had? Because he put a pile of cards in my hand.
We each drew.
Right. So, but those are game moments. Like that, to me, that goes beyond the fact that I drew, 15 cards or however many cards I drew. It was that was a moment in the game that was just huge. It was just interesting to watch, to see how that played out in and of itself. Forget about what you got because you drew these 15 or 20 cards or whatever it was.
I think, too, something that maybe you won't necessarily think about, the general you, not you specifically, but something that doesn't get thought about enough with drawing cards is that, like you were saying, if you draw too many cards, you have to discard at the end of turn. That can affect your deck building in 2 ways. One, put in ways to get a maximum hand size. You've got your Thought Vessels, you've got your Reliquary Towers, you've got your Folio of Fancies. Great. Or you spend so much time during your turn trying to figure out what to discard. And that's slowing the game down. And that's not fun for anybody, sitting there waiting for you to discard. And, sure, people can, start their turns and in a casual setting, it's like in an extremely casual setting, it's fine. Like, just start your turn, whatever, nobody cares. But there is a strategic reason to not start your turn, because, you know, if somebody sees you play out X, Y, or Z, they're gonna not want to discard something, but they would have had to already discard.
Yeah, and I've run into that. I've been victim to that myself, where I had 9 cards in hand. I needed to discard 2, and the next person started their turn because I was just discarding, and I was mulling over. It was a land, and then there was another card. It was going to be one of 2 cards, and they started their turn. They tapped and they played, and I'm just like, oh, now I should definitely be discarding this one because I want to hang on to this card. And I'm like, okay, no. Without knowing what you just saw, which of these would you discard? And I had, and it's a casual game, so I discarded the one that I would have discarded had I not known what was just about to be played. But yeah, I mean, that's not always the scenario, and generally speaking, you don't really want to force people to have to play that style. So you do want to try and get your discard done before they start,
Right. Which, like, I mean, kind of comes from a few areas. Like, say you draw 10, then obviously you're going to have a harder time figuring out what you want to discard. But also, it kind of goes into the idea of playing the draw spell. Say you draw 10, you know what you want out of those 10. Pretty straightforward, like, generally. Like,
well,
if you're at a point,
I'm generally a blind slate, shocked by every card that I see. It's like, this is in my deck. I forgot.
Why is this a red card? This is a green-blue deck. And like that, I mean, that's a thing too, though. Is like, if you're drawing 10, you're at a point in the game where you can afford to draw 10, and with your Balloon Sun Zenith, obviously, at instant speed, you have a whole turn, because you're probably going to be doing it end of turn, and then you've got your whole turn before you have to discard. But for, brevity's sake, you want to have the game continue going. And if you don't have your no maximum hand size type effects, then, like, you're going to have to discard, knowing fairly quickly, like, I want to play this, but either it's too early in the game, too late in the game, it's not going to help the board state, it's going to, whatever.
Yeah, I will say that
going into the draw is as important as when you're discarding, because it's going to affect how long it takes you to discard.
Right, because, I mean, in theory, before you're drawing, you have your plan in place. Right. This is what I intend to do. And then you start doing it, and then you draw your cards, and it's like, did these cards help the plan, or do they change the plan? So if they help the plan, that's great. If they don't, then the plan doesn't change. You're going to continue down that path. You just didn't get any help. Or, no, the new cards now say this is the best plan. So you now need to change the plan and start in. And all of this needs to happen at a quick pace. I mean, you definitely don't want to be, drawing your 10 cards and then working out what the entire new plan is. Like, okay, so that's the new plan. So what can I do on this turn? Nothing. All right, but this is the new plan. Go. And then you start to discard after having sat there for 5 minutes trying to figure out what the new plan is. I'm like, great. That's just not... Yeah. That's not the way we want people to play.
I think it's important to point out, like, this. I've seen this happen at 2 cards. Like, 10 cards makes sense why it might disrupt your plan.
Sure.
2 cards, it's possible, sure, but, like, there's only so much mulling it over that can be done. And Andy, I think that, like,
Andy, I've told you, I am sorry. I really, you just don't need to keep harping on this. I mean,
it's funny because it's not even about you this time. But seriously, like, it's tough because, I mean, obviously hand size is a real issue. I've got these tiny little things, and it's tough because with 100 card singleton deck, like, you don't know what you're going to get generally. You know what you put in the deck, but how many times have you milled out in the past year?
Twice.
Where I guess you've seen every single card in your deck. Twice, you said?
Twice, but let's be honest here. I mean, when you get milled out in a game of Commander, I mean, there's the rare occurrence where the game genuinely goes that long and you're drawing a lot of extra cards and you mill out. But both games where I milled out, it was a case of I drew 20 cards and then was forced to discard them and draw 20 more and discard them and draw 20 more. Yeah. And that's how it works. So you're seeing all of the cards, but it's not altering your plan because all you're seeing is, are there any instants in here that I can play before they do this again? That's the sum total of it. So you spin through your new set of cards. No. Okay, I guess I'm hosed. Bang, draw 20 more and see what else I can play in this bunch. So that was generally how I got milled. It's hard to see that as even card draw.
Right.
That's not really card draw. They're basically trying to get you to draw so much that you're forced to discard. It's more of a discard than anything.
And that kind of helps prove my point of like drawing is enough of a gamble because you are playing a 100 card singleton deck that like you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. Right. You've built some consistency into the deck, and drawing, even if you were to draw your whole deck, then you have to go through it and figure out what you want to play. But like so rarely do we effectively draw any sort of significant percentage of our deck in even our 12 13 turn games.
Well, I mean, and by significant percentage we're saying like over 50%. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, and I will say that the card draw itself, beyond drawing a card on the start of your turn, I don't tend to play a lot of card draw. So in an average game, if the game goes 12 turns, in theory, if you've only just drawn a card at the start of every turn, then you've seen 19 cards. And in that game, those kind of games, I guess that I'll see a maximum of 40. Just because over that length, there'll be a few card draw spells that'll draw me some extra cards, and sometimes I'll hit something where I'm getting to draw 2 or 3 cards a turn. But I mean, not often and not always. So
even in that game that we were just talking about with Andrew's Quain deck, he played Quain out on curve, turn 2.
Yep.
I gave it haste. We all drew. So from that point on in the game, I think Quain lasted until the last turn.
Yeah.
From that point on, we were all drawing 2 cards.
Yes.
And the point of his deck was to get Folio Fancies out, so none of us had maximum hand sizes, which was great also.
Yeah.
And then made us draw multiple cards each round. So we were exponentially...
Yeah, it was, double your hand size, kind of.
Yeah, we were all hastening the fact that we could conceivably draw more than we would in a normal game.
Right.
Now, the last turn of the game, or the last round of the game, saw a Folio Fancies, a copy of Folio Fancies, and the idea was that we were all going to draw X amount of cards, and then he was going to try to mill at least one of us out. The most dangerous one, Bruce. But then he got to the point where he was going to, and he looked at our deck sizes, our library sizes, and we still had more than half of our decks left.
Yeah.
And so like there is this real cause for concern of what's drawing too much, but because of timing, but also there's this. It's not so much a concern of what's too much draw, but what like how many sources is too many.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what you were talking about before,
right?
And obviously, you've got these factors of like, A, what's considered a source of card draw, and B, what is like what type of source is it? Like you were saying,
right?
And I mean, like some people have their favorites, and great. But I also have milled out, I think, twice in the past year.
Yeah.
And it was with the same deck It was my Omnath 3-color deck.
Sure.
And I think even that deck has minimal amount of quote unquote draw a card, other than Omnath itself and a few other elementals where, ETB draw a card. And the issue with that deck, obviously, it's too synergistic, and all it does is just base itself on its synergies. It has a hard time closing out the game. And I think that's where it comes in, is maybe this has even too much draw for its own good because it has a lack of win con, which is another issue that you can run into when you have too much draw because you're taking away from the other categories.
Right.
That was a bit of a mess.
No, and I think
a sec.
I think that sort of landed us right where I want to be after the break, because I do want to go in and look at how many card draw spells do you need.
Right.
How many should you have in your deck? Because too many, and then you've just got a bunch of spells that are drawing you cards and not action cards that are actually going to win you the game, or not enough, which means you're never going to draw into the action cards that you wanted because you're just not drawing enough cards. So there's a balance there, and I kind of want to take a look at that and try and figure out where we should be landing, and what sort of numbers are we looking at.
So we'll be right back. This episode of Temple of Falspod is brought to you by Mask of Grizzlebrand, because who doesn't love lifelink, flying, and value off of death triggers? Mask of Grizzlebrand, coming at you in the skies.
This episode of Temple of Falspod is brought to you by Temple Bell, because what's better than you drawing a card? Everybody drawing a card. Temple Bell. Hey folks, we're back. Let's crunch some numbers. I know, This is the fun, exciting part of the podcast that everyone is waiting for. Yay, number
Everybody
crunching.
loves math, Bruce.
Ooh, boy, math. Okay, so...
I say that jokingly, but then I realize this is Magic the Gathering. Everybody does love math.
Right. So the goal here is we're looking to get card draw, but realistically, you want card draw early, because without getting it early, you're getting it late. And while, hey, we want it late in the game as well, but you really do want it early. I mean, early card draw is the equivalent of, it can be the cultivate that you haven't found yet. It can, it finds it's just going to draw you into more cards, which are, make it more likely you're going to hit all your land drops. It does, obviously card draw just does everything. So you want to hit it early. But the question is how early. I would say that you want to hit card draw by turn 4, because by turn 4 you should, in theory, have 4 mana, which should mean that you can afford to pay for whatever spell it is that you're looking to play that's going to draw you the cards. If that's the case, then you've seen 11 cards at that point, and you want at least one of those cards to have been a card draw spell. So just based on that, you're looking at 1 card in every 11, or if you round it off, 1 in every 10. So you're looking at 10 card draw spells that you want to have in your deck. However, the numbers don't really work that way. You do want to bump it up even a little higher than that, because just because 1 in 10 cards is the card draw spell, it doesn't mean that every time you draw 10 cards, you're going to get one. So you have to look at the percentages and go a little deeper. So you should be running even more than that. The difficulty, though, is that if you do have 12 of these 12 card draw spells in your deck, and you get that one early, and you play it, okay, so then the next time you want another one is going to be what, 2 turns, 3 turns down the road? The problem is you've already seen now a pile of cards. So there's a very good chance when you are ready to play your next card draw spell, you'll have drawn 2, maybe 3 more of them, just because you've already been drawing extra, because you've drawn extra cards. So it's an interesting, and this is why I ask, how much is enough? How much is too much? Because arguably, if you must have it in the early going, you want that many more card draw spells. But are you really looking for that in the late game? I mean, The late game when you're drawing, oh, look, I drew a card that says I get to draw 3 more cards. Like, well, good, because you'll get to draw 3 more. But in the end, you're really only netting 2 more cards because you just drew a card draw spell. Over 10% of your deck is just cards that say, draw a card. You're losing out on action spells, the cards that actually win you the game. And on top of that, you're basically saying all those other cards are going to cost a little bit more because you have to pay for the card draw cards to get to them. So I'm never sure how many is the right number, because there's no doubting that you want to have card draw. Decks without card draw don't win games. You are relying way too much on luck to pull stuff off the top of your deck. But at what point do you say, this is just too many? Because there is a point where it's too many. I doubt that anybody will say that 12 is too many, but 15?
Right.
Is 15 too many? Like, where do you stop? I mean, with ramp, I always feel like more ramp just means you've got more mana to play more of the spells that you get. But even with ramp, it's the same kind of thing. At some point, the return on investment just fades, and I feel like it fades with card draw as well.
I think a good example to do would be, I mean, especially even with ramp too, is like looking at it if you are in a position under pressure. So like toward the end game or after a board wipe. So after a board wipe, obviously the thing you want to do is build up your board state again. With ramp, you can play ramp and you'll still be kind of keeping up with everybody around you.
Right.
But you always have a creature to play because you always have your commander. So ramp, you can ramp into playing your commander again. Or with card draw spells, you can draw more card draw spells. And that's where it starts to fall apart, is the idea that all you're drawing is just card draw spells, or most of what you're drawing is card draw spells. Even drawing a card draw spell from a card draw spell is disappointing. You're going to look at it and be like, oh, God.
Right. And the problem isn't so much that you're drawing into another spell that says draw a card or draw cards, because that's fine. It just means that you're going to get to draw more cards and continue to dig for the card that you want. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's fine. The difficulty is this is all costing you mana. There's a cost that comes with this. Now, the cost isn't the card itself. Because if I play a card that says draw 4 cards, the net is I'm drawing 3 because I have the card draw spell that I'm using to get those other 4. So I'm seeing 3 cards that could do something. Now, if 2 of them aren't the cards I'm looking for, and the third one is another card that says draw 4 cards, well, okay, so then I'm seeing 3 more new cards, and that's still good because I'm still searching for the card that I want. But the downside is the cost. At what point do you say, that card you're looking for that you've now found, great, but can you afford it anymore because you've spent, 6 mana, say, 8 mana, whatever. Great, you're going to hold on to that. You're going to have to wait a full turn to actually play the action card the following turn.
Right.
It's a diminishing return, and it's definitely something you need to consider. I mean, and we know this is true, or else the best decks would just run card draw.
Right.
Just all card draw and 1 or 2 cards that actually finish the game. Because you're willing to just keep drawing until you find something, and that's just not viable, and we know that. So but
I think it's tough too, because then you have things that are just essentially just value engines, like 1 card value engines, like Mulldrifter, for example. Mulldrifter is a 5 mana 2/2 that when it enters you draw 2 cards, which great, it replaces itself and draws you an extra card.
Right.
You can also play it for 3 mana to just get that and a dice trigger.
Right.
Which, in the right decks has amazing value. It's a bear that has an effect. It's a 2/2, 4/2 with a 3 mana effect stapled onto it. And with drawing those 2 cards, it's like that's what this format ends up coming down to, is like these specific cards that have 2, 3, 4 like effects stapled onto it, where it's like, okay, you've got a creature, You can have a dies trigger if you need it, or you just get two. You get 2 cards out of it anyway. So it's like it just keeps building up where it's mana efficient, it's card efficient, and I mean obviously that's what you're looking for in card draw, which is why Muldrifter gets printed every other set, every other commander set.
Right, and it's also why you see a lot of the loops. I mean,
right.
Emil loves a card that says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card, because Emil will bounce that thing over and over and over again to keep drawing the card, or to keep getting whatever effect you want. But we're talking about card draw here.
Right. And I mean, it kind of comes down to that value of well, okay, say, with Emil, for example.
Yeah.
You have a card. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You flicker it. You now have twice the value out of that card.
Right.
Close to twice the value out of that card than you did just playing the card.
Right.
Which is why, to an extent, card draw stapled onto onto creatures, or really any permanent, is much more valuable than your instants and sorceries if you're not playing a deck that is built around, playing instants and sorceries. If you're not playing a strictly Spellslinger deck, creatures with card draw deserve the slot more than just, X, Y, or Z.
I sort of agree with you. However, if you don't have a way to loop that, then, take Muldrifter. Muldrifter's there, you play the card out, you draw your cards. If it doesn't do if it never draws you any more cards, wouldn't you be better off with a spell that lets you draw a card or 2 cards every turn? Because you will draw more cards from that enchantment or whatever.
Right. Which is
or even
which
an
is why
or even an instant that draws 5 at once.
That's fair.
But I get what you're saying.
That's also the value of just having a creature to block as well. I mean,
Yes.
I tried to specify enough to say permanence, because those enchantments that draw you cards regardless of situation are primo.
Right.
But
so in the end, I keep coming back to this. How many cards should I have in the deck to draw cards? And I think what I'm looking at, practically speaking, is, in a rough estimation, and obviously this is different for every deck. It's different depending on who your commander is. We've talked about Brina recently, and I would say that in a Brina deck you would need fewer cards dedicated to card draw, just because Brina does this for you and you have constant access to it. But so say your average deck, I think I'm looking at between 8 and up to 10 spells that are dedicated to drawing me cards. And then I'm also going to be looking at least a handful, say another 4 or maybe 5 creatures or other spells that are the cantrip, that just draw that one card. Because, you play the card, you get to draw. Okay, great. So if I don't get one of those draw spells in the early going, hopefully I'll at least have had a creature that cantrips so I can draw at least 1 or 2 extra cards. And hopefully that will get me closer to one of the other card draw spells that'll let me dig deep into my library. So that's sort of where I think I'm landing on this. Generally speaking, that's what I've instinctively done with most of my decks. I don't think I put nearly enough alternatives, because I have a deep affinity to enchantments and artifacts that draw a card each turn, or draw a card when some effect happens, and usually the effect is something that happens once a turn. I like the idea of staying under the radar on card draw. So I'm not the guy who plays a lot of Blue Sun Zenith. I'm not the guy who, will play the instant that lets them draw 3 cards, and then that card goes away, just because I just don't want attention drawn to me because I'm drawing cards.
And I think that it's a definite tough balance. I think somewhere between, obviously, with any deck you're looking for as many cards that can overlap categories as possible. So having cards dedicated to just card draw is a luxury, for one. Your Phyrexian arenas, your other things that do that. And so, like, obviously looking for something that does more than that is where you want to start regardless. And so, like, cards that are dedicated to drawing cards, for me, in my decks, end up being much lower just because, A, they're last thoughts. They're things that I'm like, I should probably do that. And B, I'm bad at building decks. It's generally a thing that I haven't gotten used to yet. So like whenever I'm like putting in cards, I'm having a hard time cutting other cards for just card draw because I want my decks to do certain things. But then there comes the case of like, well, I'm not drawing into them. I've got 2 cards in hand and they're both land, and I don't want to play either of them so that I can, bluff whatever.
Right.
And so there is the danger of not drawing enough because you're gonna end up flushing away your hand early, and then either a board wipe's gonna come or you're just not gonna run out of value. And so as much as it pains me, there is a lower limit to your card draw specifics, which I think 4 or 5 may be still too low. I mean, it's 1/20th of the deck. It's 5%, right, obviously, but
right. And we just finished saying that we rarely get through over half of our deck. So if you're not getting through half of your deck and only 4 or 5 cards are drawing you cards, I mean, how often does that mean you're never going to find one of those cards?
Let me tell you, it's often.
It is. I will say that, I keep joking about Phyrexian Arena and this kind of thing. Most of my repeatable card draw are cards that do something else. Like, I particularly like Ob Nixilis Reignited. A Planeswalker whose +1 ability is you draw a card and lose a life. So, Phyrexian Arena, but only when you want it. So if you don't want to draw the card, you don't have to. And his -3 is destroy target creature. So I do have, so the card does something else when I need it to. And that's a nice thing. Now I appreciate that it costs 5 and it's a Planeswalker, so it gets targeted immediately. But, it's, I can usually draw 2 or 3 cards off of Ob Nixilis. So, but that's the sort of style of card that I tend to look for when I'm looking for cards that draw.
It's been an interesting ride for me thinking about card draw, because one of my favorite decks right now is my Lelia deck, which, for all intents and purposes, is extreme draw. Like, it's just every turn it pumps out a card from the top of my deck, and I can either play it that turn or lose it forever.
Right. And Lelia brings out the whole other discussion of what kind of card draw makes sense. Because with Lelia, you're drawing it, you're playing it, or you're losing it. So there's a limit to how many cards you want to draw that way. So
yeah, I think there's a special place in my Commander heart for Lelia where if I could get everybody who plays Commander to play that deck once, I think that they would understand how little a single card means in their deck. Right. And I feel like it's helped me build decks better because I don't necessarily stress out about each single card in my deck, because I can see how quickly they can just churn through and how much they don't affect my game at all, because I'm watching them being exiled. I'm like, all right, that sucks. But after like the 3rd or 4th game with this deck, I've been like, oh, I don't care. I've got more in this deck. It's funny that deck hasn't milled itself out, but it's such a big threat that just kind of comes and
give it time.
Give it time. Yeah. I think as we wrap up here, card draw is important. I don't think either of us have tried to say otherwise, but too much card draw can be boring. And we found that a good place to stick the landing with dedicated card draw, cards that more often than not when you play them you will be drawing cards, is somewhere between 7 and 8. Is that what you said?
If you follow the stats then you're looking for at least 12 pieces of card draw. But I'm just not sure that as the game progresses that you're going to be happy having that many of them in the deck.
Yeah.
Make your decisions and keep your commander in mind. I mean, obviously, a commander like Tulane is not going to need 12 other ways to draw cards. But yeah, I mean, when you do the stats, it gets a little disheartening when you realize just how many of each thing you're supposed to be putting in your deck. So,
and I think that kind of goes to show where we stand too with the format in general. I think that where you stand in terms of your level of play, not necessarily your power level or anything, but just how casual you want the game to be. Right. We'll see the more casual it gets, the less card draw you have, because you'll be drawing more turns, and B, you'll be you want the chaos of it all to kind of overwhelm you. So the more cards you draw, the less chaotic it'll be, because the more consistent you're being.
Right. I mean, I don't run tutors because I don't want to see the same cards over and over again. Well, I want to see more cards, but I also don't want my card draw to become a case where, oh, look, I'm now drawing into, 75% of my deck, which means, in theory, I'm basically looking for the same stuff over and over again because I've drawn so many. So, yeah.
And I'm sure we'll revisit this topic eventually. Maybe we'll feel differently. Who knows? But I want to, again, take some time to thank each and every one of you for listening. It's been a great 2 years. I don't know what I would rather do with my time than sit here for an hour each week and talk to you, Bruce. Other than play Magic. So I think that's going to do it for us this week. If you have anything to say to our viewers, do so now.
Just appreciate everyone listening in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on card draw and get a sense of what you're doing as far as how are you making the card draw work in your decks.
That's going to do it for us this week. We're Temple of the False Pod, where decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Thank you again so much for listening. Play some Magic for me, and may your fifth land be the Temple.
Bye!
Wait. Before you go, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. You can reach out to us via email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com or on Twitter at falsepodmtg. Bruce is at Manaburned, and I'm at Andy Weekend, though you'll definitely notice I use the podcast Twitter far more often. Now that we've got you here, make sure you subscribe, rate us on whatever podcast platform you use. It helps us out. It gets us more reach. Subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Like a video there. Leave some comments for more casual enjoyment. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with some more timeless discussions about all things casual. So come hang out, and may your fifth land be the Temple. Bye-bye. Should I do my best, Bruce? Bye!